Hey everyone. Tonight, we're diving into a story that sounds like pure science fiction, but happened right here on our planet. Picture this: an Earth completely encased in ice from the poles all the way down to the equator. No blue oceans, no green continents, just a giant white marble spinning through space. This isn't some distant exoplanet we're talking about. This was Earth, our Earth, roughly 650 million years ago. Now, before you settle in, take a moment to hit that like button and subscribe if you enjoy these deep dives into our planet's incredible history. And let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is there. I always love seeing our global community come together for these stories. Tonight's tale begins in what might seem like the most unlikely places to find evidence of a global ice age. We're talking about some of the hottest, most brutal deserts on the planet. Death Valley in California, where summer temperatures regularly soar past 120 degrees. The Australian outback, where the sun beats down mercilessly on red dirt and scattered scrub. These places are about as far from an ice age as you can imagine, yet buried in their rocks lies proof of the most extreme climate disaster our planet has ever endured. The story starts with something called a dropstone. Now, I know that doesn't sound particularly exciting, but bear with me because these rocks are absolutely fascinating. Picture a boulder, maybe the size of a small car, sitting in the middle of what was once an ancient muddy seafloor. That boulder has no business being there. It's completely out of place, like finding a penguin in the Sahara Desert. You see, when sediments settle naturally at the bottom of ancient seas, they form neat, organized layers. Sand with sand, mud with mud, everything sorted by size and weight. But these dropstones, they're different. They're massive chunks of rock sitting right in the middle of fine sediments where they absolutely should not be. The only way to get a boulder into the middle of a muddy seafloor is if something carried it there and then dropped it. And there's really only one thing powerful enough to transport house-sized boulders across thousands of miles of ocean. Ice. Massive glaciers and ice sheets act like nature's freight trains. They scrape rocks from mountainsides, carry them incredible distances, and when the ice eventually melts, it drops its cargo wherever it happens to be. Today, we can see this process in action in places like Alaska, where glaciers transport countless tons of rock debris down mountain valleys. But the dropstones found in Death Valley and Australia tell a much more dramatic story. Scientists can actually determine exactly where on Earth these rocks were located when they formed, thanks to something called paleomagnetic analysis. Every rock contains tiny magnetic particles that align with Earth's magnetic field when the rock forms. It's like a fossil compass, permanently recording the rock's position on the planet. When researchers analysed the magnetic signatures of these dropstones, they made a shocking discovery. 650 million years ago, both Death Valley and Australia were located near the equator. Think about that for a moment. The equator, the warmest part of our planet, where tropical rainforests thrive and temperatures rarely drop below comfortable levels, was covered in ice sheets thick enough to carry boulders across entire ocean basins. If ice existed at the equator, then the entire planet must have been frozen solid. There's simply no other explanation. Scientists call this phenomenon Snowball Earth, and it represents the most severe ice age in our planet's history. We're not talking about ice sheets that covered parts of North America and Europe, like in more recent ice ages. We're talking about ice everywhere, from the North Pole to the South Pole, with absolutely no refuge from the cold. Imagine trying to visualize this frozen world. The familiar blue marble we know and love would have been completely unrecognizable. Instead of swirling white clouds over blue oceans and brown and green continents, you'd see nothing but white. Brilliant, reflective white ice covering every surface. The oceans, frozen solid under ice sheets potentially thousands of feet thick. The continents, buried under glaciers that made Antarctica look tropical by comparison. But how does a planet go from having liquid oceans and presumably some form of climate suitable for early life, to becoming a giant ice cube? The answer lies in the delicate balance of our atmosphere, specifically in the levels of carbon dioxide. Carbon dioxide might be a villain in today's climate discussions, but it's actually essential for keeping our planet warm enough to support life. These greenhouse gases act like a blanket around Earth, trapping heat from the sun and maintaining temperatures that allow liquid water to exist. It's a delicate balancing act that's been going on for billions of years. Too much carbon dioxide, and you get runaway greenhouse warming like we see on Venus, where surface temperatures reach nearly 900 degrees Fahrenheit. Too little carbon dioxide, and the planet begins to cool. But here's where things get really interesting and really dangerous. There's a point where the cooling becomes unstoppable, a tipping point where the planet slides into a catastrophic deep freeze. 650 million years ago, something began stripping carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere at an unprecedented rate. That something was a process called weathering, and it was happening on a scale never seen before or since. When carbon dioxide in the atmosphere mixes with water vapor, it forms weak carbonic acid. This acid rain might sound scary, but it's actually a natural process that's been happening throughout Earth's history. When this acidic rain falls on rocks, it reacts with minerals, essentially dissolving them and carrying the dissolved carbon dioxide away in runoff water. That water eventually makes its way to the oceans, where the carbon dioxide gets locked up in limestone and other sedimentary rocks. Under normal circumstances, this process helps regulate Earth's climate. It's part of a natural thermostat that prevents things from getting too hot or too cold. But 650 million years ago, conditions were anything but normal. At that time, most of Earth's land masses were clustered together in a supercontinent positioned right at the equator. This meant that virtually all of the planet's land was located in the hottest, most humid climate zone, where weathering happens most rapidly. It was like putting the entire planet's thermostat in a sauna. The weathering process went into overdrive. Massive amounts of carbon dioxide were being stripped from the atmosphere and locked away in rocks at the bottom of ancient seas. But there was another factor making the situation even worse. The dominant life forms at the time were cyanobacteria, microscopic organisms that had been around for billions of years. These bacteria might have been tiny, but they were incredibly good at what they did: photosynthesis. They absorbed carbon dioxide from the water around them and used it to build limestone structures called stromatolites. Under normal circumstances, this biological carbon dioxide removal would be balanced by other processes that return CO2 to the atmosphere. But this wasn't normal circumstances. The combination of supercharged weathering from the equatorial supercontinent and massive biological carbon dioxide removal by cyanobacteria created a perfect storm. Carbon dioxide levels in the atmosphere began to plummet. As greenhouse gas concentrations dropped, global temperatures started falling. Ice began forming at the poles, just like in any normal ice age. But this time, something different happened. As the ice spread, it triggered a feedback loop that would ultimately doom the planet to a frozen fate. You see, different surfaces reflect different amounts of sunlight back into space. Dark surfaces like open ocean water are excellent at absorbing solar energy, which helps keep the planet warm. But bright surfaces like snow and ice are incredibly good at reflecting that energy back into space before it can warm the planet. As ice sheets began expanding from the poles, they replaced dark ocean water with brilliant white ice. This meant less solar energy was being absorbed by the planet, and more was being reflected back into space. The planet cooled further, which allowed even more ice to form, which reflected even more sunlight, which cooled the planet even more. It was a runaway refrigeration effect, and once it got started, there was no stopping it. The ice sheets marched relentlessly toward the equator, reflecting ever more sunlight and cooling the planet further with each passing year. Eventually, the ice sheets from the north and south met somewhere around what we now call the tropics, sealing Earth's fate as a giant snowball. For 25 million years, our planet remained locked in this frozen state. 25 million years of perpetual winter, with ice sheets potentially miles thick covering every ocean and continent. The sun still shone, but most of its energy was simply reflected back into space by the brilliant white surface of our frozen world. Life, which had spent over 3 billion years slowly evolving and spreading through Earth's oceans, suddenly found itself trapped beneath an impenetrable shell of ice. The few organisms that existed at the time were simple, single-celled bacteria and algae. They had survived countless challenges over billions of years, but nothing like this. Most life on Earth died. The fossil record from this period is remarkably sparse, suggesting that the vast majority of species simply couldn't adapt to the extreme conditions. But some organisms, the ultimate survivors, managed to hang on in the most unlikely places. Deep beneath the ice, in the perpetual darkness of the frozen oceans, communities of microbes found ways to survive. Some huddled around underwater volcanic vents, drawing energy from the heat and chemicals seeping up from Earth's interior. Others went into a kind of suspended animation, essentially freezing themselves until conditions improved. These weren't just any microbes. They were extremophiles, organisms specifically adapted to survive in conditions that would kill almost anything else. They could withstand temperatures far below freezing, survive without sunlight for extended periods, and even repair their DNA after it was damaged by the harsh conditions. The question that haunted scientists for decades was simple. How did life not only survive this global catastrophe, but actually emerge from it stronger and more complex than ever before? Because that's exactly what happened. When the ice finally melted, life didn't just return to its previous state. Instead, it exploded into the most dramatic evolutionary leap in Earth's history. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. First, we need to understand how this frozen world finally came back to life, and what force was powerful enough to melt ice sheets that had covered the planet for 25 million years. The answer was building up pressure deep beneath the ice in the molten heart of our planet itself. Volcanoes, the same geological forces that create new land and reshape continents, were about to become Earth's salvation. But that's a story for our next part, where we'll explore how the planet's own internal heat fought back against the global freeze, and how the end of Snowball Earth triggered the most important evolutionary revolution in the history of life. While Earth remained locked in its icy prison, something was stirring far below the frozen surface. Deep within the planet's molten core, immense geological forces were building pressure, preparing to stage one of the most dramatic rescues in planetary history. The same volcanic systems that had helped shape continents and ocean floors were about to become the unlikely heroes of this frozen world. Now, you might be wondering how a few volcanic eruptions could possibly make a dent in ice sheets thousands of feet thick, covering the entire planet. After all, we've seen volcanoes erupt through ice before, and while impressive, they usually create relatively small holes that refreeze pretty quickly. But the volcanoes of Snowball Earth weren't just a few isolated peaks scattered here and there. We're talking about a coordinated assault by thousands of volcanic systems across the globe, all working together over millions of years. Picture the most explosive volcanic eruption you've ever seen footage of. Mount St. Helens, perhaps, with its massive ash cloud and devastating power. Now multiply that by thousands and stretch it out over geological timescales. That's what was happening beneath the ice sheets of Snowball Earth. Volcanic eruptions were punching through miles of solid ice, sending torrents of superheated gases, ash and lava into the frozen atmosphere. But the real game changer wasn't the heat from these eruptions, though that certainly helped. The secret weapon was something much more subtle, but infinitely more powerful: carbon dioxide. Every volcanic eruption, releases massive quantities of greenhouse gases, and with thousands of volcanoes active simultaneously over millions of years, the amount of CO2 being pumped into the atmosphere was absolutely staggering. Remember, it was the depletion of atmospheric carbon dioxide that had triggered Snowball Earth in the first place. The weathering of rocks and the activities of cyanobacteria had stripped away the planet's natural greenhouse blanket, allowing temperatures to plummet. Now, volcanoes were essentially doing the opposite, restoring that crucial greenhouse gas layer one eruption at a time. This wasn't a quick process by human standards. We're talking about roughly 1 million years of sustained volcanic activity, slowly but steadily building up atmospheric carbon dioxide levels. For most of that time, the ice remained firmly in control. The planet was still reflecting most of the sun's energy back into space, and even with rising CO2 levels, surface temperatures remained brutally cold. But greenhouse gases are patient. They accumulate in the atmosphere, trapping more and more heat with each passing century. Scientists estimate that carbon dioxide levels eventually rose to perhaps 100 times what they were during the initial freeze. The atmosphere became a supercharged greenhouse, capturing and holding on to every bit of solar energy that managed to penetrate through to the surface. Then, somewhere around 635 million years ago, the system reached a critical tipping point. Just as there had been a point of no return on the way into the freeze, there was now a point of no return on the way out. The enhanced greenhouse effect finally overcame the reflective power of the ice sheets, and temperatures began to rise rapidly. What happened next was one of the most dramatic climate reversals in Earth's history. The same feedback loops that had created Snowball Earth now worked in reverse. As surface ice began to melt, it exposed darker ocean water underneath. That darker water absorbed solar energy instead of reflecting it, which caused more warming, which melted more ice, which exposed more dark water, and so on. The transition from frozen planet to liquid world probably happened remarkably quickly by geological standards. Some scientists estimate that the majority of the ice melted within just a few thousand years. Imagine the chaos as ice sheets miles thick began collapsing into the warming oceans, creating massive floods and tsunamis that reshaped coastlines around the globe. The newly liberated oceans were unlike anything we see today. They were superheated by the extreme greenhouse atmosphere, possibly reaching temperatures of over 120 degrees Fahrenheit in some regions. Massive hurricanes, far more powerful than anything in recorded history, churned across these scalding seas. The atmospheric pressure was intense, and the air was thick with water vapor and volcanic gases. But here's where the story takes its most fascinating turn. You might expect that life, having barely survived 25 million years of deep freeze, would take a long time to recover from such an ordeal. Maybe millions of years to slowly rebuild the simple bacterial communities that had existed before the freeze. Instead, something unprecedented happened. Life didn't just recover, it exploded into complexity in what scientists now recognize as one of the most important evolutionary leaps in the history of our planet. Within just a few million years after the ice melted, the first multicellular organisms appeared in the fossil record. Now that might not sound like much to us, but remember that life had existed as nothing but single-celled bacteria and algae for over 3 billion years before Snowball Earth. 3 billion years of evolutionary experimentation, and the most complex thing on the planet was still essentially pond scum. Then, in the geological blink of an eye after the Great Thaw, life suddenly figured out how to build bodies with multiple cells working together. These weren't just random clusters of cells either. These early multicellular organisms had specialized tissues, organized body plans, and sophisticated structures. Some looked like fronds, others resembled discs or ribbons. A few even developed the first primitive nervous systems. They represent the earliest experiments in what would eventually become every complex life form on Earth, including us. Scientists call this evolutionary explosion the Ediacaran biota, named after the Ediacara Hills in Australia, where some of the first fossils were discovered. These creatures were unlike anything that exists today, with body plans so alien that researchers initially couldn't even figure out which end was supposed to be the head. But what triggered this sudden burst of evolutionary creativity? The answer lies in chemistry, specifically in the levels of oxygen in Earth's atmosphere and oceans. Before Snowball Earth, oxygen concentrations were extremely low, perhaps only 1% of current levels. That's barely enough to support the simplest forms of life. Certainly not enough to power the complex cellular processes needed for multicellular organisms. During the freeze, something remarkable happened to change that equation. The ice sheets weren't just solid water, they were complex chemical factories. As sunlight penetrated the upper layers of ice, it triggered chemical reactions that produced hydrogen used to clean wounds, though in peroxide, essentially the same stuff you might much more dilute concentrations. This hydrogen peroxide remained locked in the ice for millions of years, accumulating slowly but steadily. When the Great Thaw finally came, all of that stored chemical energy was suddenly released into the oceans. Hydrogen peroxide breaks down naturally into water and oxygen, and with 25 million years worth of the stuff suddenly decomposing all at once, oxygen levels in the atmosphere and oceans skyrocketed. The timing was perfect. Just as life was emerging from its frozen prison, the planet suddenly had abundant oxygen to fuel more complex forms of cellular respiration. It was like switching from a small campfire to a roaring furnace. Cells could now generate far more energy than ever before, and that energy could be used to support the complex processes needed for multicellular life. But there was another crucial factor at play. The extreme conditions of Snowball Earth and its aftermath created what scientists call evolutionary pressure. The organisms that survived the freeze weren't just tough, they were incredibly adaptable. They had been forced to develop new survival strategies, more flexible metabolisms, and more robust cellular structures. When the ice melted and conditions began to stabilize, these battle-hardened microbes found themselves in a world of unprecedented opportunity. The oceans were largely empty of competitors, since most other life forms had gone extinct during the freeze. There were countless new ecological niches waiting to be filled, and plenty of resources to go around. In evolutionary terms, it was like hitting the reset button on the planet's ecosystem, while simultaneously providing all the tools needed for more complex life forms. The surviving organisms didn't just multiply, they diversified at an incredible rate. Some specialized in floating near the surface to capture sunlight. Others burrowed into sediments on the seafloor. Still others developed the ability to move around actively, becoming the first primitive animals. The fossil record from this period reads like a catalogue of biological experimentation. Creatures with no modern analogues appeared and disappeared within relatively short time periods. Some evolutionary experiments succeeded and became the ancestors of major animal groups. Others reached dead ends and vanished without descendants. One of the most significant developments was the evolution of predation. For the first time in Earth's history, some organisms began actively hunting and eating other organisms. This might sound obvious to us, but remember that for 3 billion years, life had consisted entirely of organisms that made their own food through photosynthesis or absorbed nutrients from their environment. The appearance of predators fundamentally changed the rules of the evolutionary game. Suddenly, being bigger, faster, or better defended became major advantages. This drove what evolutionary biologists call an arms race between predators and prey, spurring rapid innovations in both attack and defense mechanisms. Some organisms developed hard shells for protection. Others became more mobile to escape predators. Still others evolved camouflage or toxic chemicals to avoid being eaten. Each innovation by one group created new evolutionary pressures for other groups. driving ever more sophisticated adaptations. The result was an explosion of biological diversity and complexity that dwarfed anything seen in the previous 3 billion years of life on Earth. By the end of this post-Snowball Earth evolutionary burst, the oceans contained organisms with recognizable body plans, complex behaviors, and ecological relationships that would form the foundation for all future animal evolution. These weren't our direct ancestors, but they were definitely our evolutionary great-great-great-grandparents. The basic toolkit for building complex multicellular organisms, from specialized cells to organ systems to coordinated movement, was all developed during this crucial period following the Great Thaw. Scientists now believe that without Snowball Earth, life might have remained stuck in its single-celled bacterial phase indefinitely. The extreme environmental pressure created by the global freeze, followed by the oxygen-rich recovery period, provided exactly the right conditions to kickstart the evolution of complex life. It's a sobering thought. The very existence of every animal on Earth today, from the smallest insect to the largest whale, including every human being who has ever lived, can be traced back to that catastrophic freeze 650 million years ago. We are all, in a very real sense, children of Snowball Earth. But the story doesn't end with the first multicellular organisms. The evolutionary innovations triggered by Snowball Earth continued to reverberate through time, setting the stage for even more dramatic developments in the history of life. The next chapter would see the emergence of the first true animals, complete with nervous systems, digestive organs, and the ability to actively move through their environment. These early animals were nothing short of revolutionary. We're talking about creatures that could sense their environment, process information, and make decisions about where to go and what to do. After billions of years of life forms that essentially just sat there and absorbed whatever nutrients happened to float by, suddenly there were organisms actively exploring their world. The first animals were small, soft-bodied creatures that left behind some of the most intriguing fossils in the geological record. Some looked like quilted discs lying flat on the sea floor. Others resembled feathers or ferns, swaying gently in the ancient currents. A few developed the first primitive heads, with clusters of sensory cells that could detect light, chemicals, and movement. But perhaps the most significant innovation was the development of bilateral symmetry. This might sound like a dry technical term, but it represents one of the most important breakthroughs in the history of life. Bilateral symmetry means having a distinct front end and back end, a left side and right side. It's the basic body plan that virtually every complex animal uses today, including us. Think about why this matters. If you're a single-celled organism, or even a simple multicellular blob, direction doesn't really matter. You're basically just a living filter, absorbing whatever comes your way from any direction. But if you're going to actively move through your environment, especially if you're going to hunt for food or flee from predators, having a front end with concentrated sensory organs makes perfect sense. The front end becomes your early warning system, packed with eyes, chemical detectors, and other sensors to help you navigate the world. The back end becomes your propulsion system, with muscles and fins or legs to move you where you need to go. Everything in between becomes specialized for specific functions: processing food, circulating nutrients, coordinating movement. This basic blueprint was so successful that it spread rapidly through the post-Snowball Earth oceans. Within a relatively short time, bilaterally symmetric animals dominated marine ecosystems. They weren't just more successful than their radially symmetric cousins, they were actively outcompeting them for resources and habitat. The fossil sites where scientists study these early animals read like pages from an alien encyclopedia. The Ediacara Hills in South Australia, where this whole chapter of Earth's story was first discovered, contain some of the most bizarre and beautiful fossils you could imagine. Creatures with names like Dickinsonia, Sprigina, and Tribrachidium populate these ancient rock formations like visitors from another world. Dickinsonia, for example, looked like a quilted oval disc up to several feet across. It had no obvious mouth, no digestive system that we can identify, and no clear way of moving around. Yet somehow it thrived in the post-Snowball Earth oceans for millions of years. Recent chemical analysis of Dickinsonia fossils has revealed that it was definitely an animal, not a plant or fungus. But exactly how it lived and what it ate remains one of paleontology's great mysteries. Sprigina was more recognizably animal-like, with a distinct head region and segmented body that resembled a primitive worm or arthropod. It represents one of the earliest experiments in developing a centralized nervous system, with a concentration of nerve cells in the head region to process sensory information and coordinate movement. Then there were creatures like Tribrachidium, which looked like nothing so much as a three-armed pinwheel. It had a radial body plan completely unlike any modern animal, suggesting that early animal evolution was far more experimental than we might expect. Many of these early body plans were evolutionary dead ends, beautiful experiments that ultimately led nowhere. But scattered among these alien forms were the ancestors of every major animal group alive today. The first primitive sponges, simple but effective filter feeders that would become one of the most successful animal designs ever developed. Early jellyfish relatives with the first true nervous systems, capable of coordinated swimming and complex behaviors. Primitive worms that would eventually give rise to everything from insects to vertebrates. The speed of this evolutionary transformation is almost impossible to comprehend. We're talking about the development of nervous systems, digestive systems, circulatory systems, reproductive systems, and sensory organs in just a few million years. That's lightning fast by evolutionary standards, especially considering that it had taken over 3 billion years for life to even figure out how to build multicellular bodies in the first place. Scientists call this period of rapid evolutionary innovation the Cambrian explosion, though it actually began during the Ediacaran period, immediately following Snowball Earth. It represents the most dramatic increase in biological complexity in Earth's history, a time when the basic toolkit for building complex animal bodies was developed and refined. The driving forces behind this explosion were numerous and interconnected. The high oxygen levels provided the energy needed for active lifestyles and complex organ systems. The empty ecological landscape provided countless opportunities for new ways of life. The evolution of predation created intense selective pressure for better defense and mobility systems. But there was another crucial factor that scientists are only beginning to understand. The extreme environmental fluctuations associated with Snowball Earth and its aftermath appear to have accelerated the rate of evolutionary change itself. Organisms living in rapidly changing environments are under constant pressure to adapt or die, and this pressure can lead to much faster rates of genetic innovation. Modern studies of evolution in extreme environments have shown that organisms can develop new adaptations remarkably quickly when faced with severe environmental stress. The survivors of Snowball Earth weren't just tough, they were genetically flexible, capable of rapid evolutionary responses to changing conditions. This genetic flexibility, combined with the unprecedented environmental opportunities of the post-Snowball Earth world, created perfect conditions for explosive evolutionary innovation. It was like having a laboratory full of highly adaptable organisms suddenly presented with countless new problems to solve and resources to exploit. The results speak for themselves. By the end of the Ediacaran period, roughly 540 million years ago, the oceans contained representatives of virtually every major animal group that exists today. Arthropods, mollusks, echinoderms, chordates, and dozens of other major lineages had all established their basic body plans and begun diversifying into the incredible variety of forms we see in the modern world. But perhaps the most remarkable aspect of this evolutionary revolution was its permanence. Unlike many evolutionary innovations that eventually reach dead ends or get replaced by better solutions, the basic animal body plans developed during the post-Snowball Earth period have remained remarkably stable for over 500 million years. The bilateral symmetry, Centralized nervous systems, specialized organ systems, and complex developmental programs that first appeared in the Ediacaran oceans still form the foundation of animal biology today. Your own body is built using essentially the same genetic toolkit that was developed by those first experimental animals in the aftermath of our planet's greatest climate disaster. It's a humbling thought. Every time you move your hand, process a thought, or take a breath, you're using biological systems that were originally developed by primitive worms and jellyfish swimming in the superheated oceans of a newly thawed planet. The cellular machinery that powers your muscles, the neural networks that process your thoughts, the genetic programs that built your body, all of these can be traced back to innovations that first appeared in the wake of Snowball Earth. This connection between ancient climate catastrophe and modern biological complexity raises fascinating questions about the role of environmental stress in driving evolutionary innovation. Would complex life have eventually evolved without the dramatic push provided by Snowball Earth? Or was this global freeze truly necessary to kickstart the development of the animal kingdom? Some scientists argue that life might have remained permanently stuck in its simple bacterial phase without the environmental pressure cooker of Snowball Earth. The stable, low-oxygen conditions that prevailed for billions of years before the freeze were certainly comfortable for simple organisms, but they may not have provided enough selective pressure to drive the evolution of complexity. Others suggest that complex life was inevitable and that Snowball Earth simply accelerated a process that would have happened eventually anyway. In this view, the freeze was more of a catalyst than a cause, speeding up evolutionary innovations that were already in the pipeline. The truth probably lies somewhere in between. Snowball Earth certainly provided unique conditions that were particularly favorable for evolutionary innovation, but the potential for complex life was probably already present in the genetic diversity of pre-freeze organisms. The disaster didn't create the possibility of complex life so much as it provided the perfect opportunity for that possibility to be realized. What's clear is that the combination of extreme environmental stress, followed by abundant resources and opportunities, created ideal conditions for one of the most important transitions in the history of life. The humble bacteria and algae that survived the freeze emerged into a world of unprecedented possibility, and they seized that opportunity with remarkable creativity and success. The legacy of this evolutionary explosion extends far beyond the development of the first animals. The genetic innovations and developmental programs that appeared during this period continue to shape the evolution of life today. Every new species that evolves, every adaptation that develops, every biological innovation that appears, builds upon the foundational toolkit that was established in those crucial millions of years following Snowball Earth. Understanding this connection between ancient climate catastrophe and modern biological diversity has profound implications for how we think about evolution, environmental change, and the resilience of life itself. It suggests that what we might view as purely destructive events can sometimes serve as catalysts for unprecedented innovation and complexity. It also highlights the interconnected nature of Earth's climate and biological systems. The same volcanic processes that saved the planet from permanent freeze provided the chemical conditions necessary for complex life to evolve. The same oxygen that was produced by melting ice became the fuel that powered the first animal nervous systems and muscle contractions. These connections remind us that we live on a dynamic, integrated planet, where geological, atmospheric, and biological processes are constantly influencing each other in complex and sometimes surprising ways. The story of Snowball Earth and its aftermath is ultimately a story about these interconnections, about how catastrophic change in one part of the Earth system can trigger transformative innovation in another. As we continue to explore the deep history of our planet, stories like Snowball Earth provide crucial insights into the processes that have shaped the world we inhabit today. They remind us that the familiar, stable planet we know is actually the product of billions of years of dramatic change, catastrophic events, and remarkable recoveries. The next chapter of this story would see even more dramatic innovations as the first animals continue to diversify and experiment with new ways of life. Hard shells, complex eyes, sophisticated nervous systems, and eventually the first ventures onto land would all emerge from the evolutionary foundation laid down in the post-Snowball Earth oceans. But the real game changer was still to come. The creatures that emerged from this evolutionary laboratory weren't content to simply exist. They were actively reshaping their world in ways that would have seemed impossible just a few million years earlier. Picture the seafloor of these ancient oceans, perhaps 600 million years ago. For billions of years, it had been a pretty boring place. Just layers of sediment slowly accumulating, maybe some bacterial mats here and there, but nothing you could really call exciting. Now suddenly, this peaceful seafloor was under assault from a new kind of organism that had never existed before. Burrowers. These weren't your typical worms. These were revolutionary engineers, the first creatures in Earth's history to actively modify their environment on a large scale. They tunneled through sediments, creating complex networks of burrows and galleries that completely transformed the ocean floor ecosystem. For the first time in the planet's history, the boundary between water and sediment became a three-dimensional maze of interconnected tunnels. Now, this might not sound like much to us. After all, we're used to worms and other creatures living in the soil. But remember, this was completely unprecedented. For over 3 billion years, the seafloor had been essentially two-dimensional. You had the water column above and the sediment below, with a fairly sharp boundary between them. These new burrowing organisms turned that simple interface into a complex, three-dimensional habitat. The ecological implications were staggering. Burrows provided shelter for smaller organisms, created new surfaces for bacteria to colonize, and dramatically increased the amount of oxygen that could penetrate into seafloor sediments. This oxygenation of previously oxygen-free environments opened up entirely new ecological niches and accelerated chemical processes that had been dormant for billions of years. But burrowing was just the beginning. Other creatures were experimenting with completely different survival strategies. Some developed the ability to build their own protective structures, creating the first biological architecture. These weren't just simple shells. They were sophisticated engineering projects that required coordinated cellular behavior and complex biochemical processes. The construction of these early shells and skeletons represented another quantum leap in biological complexity. Building hard structures requires specialized cells that can extract minerals from seawater, transport them to construction sites, and organize them into precisely controlled patterns. It's basically biological manufacturing, and it appeared for the first time during this post-Snowball Earth evolutionary explosion. These early architects weren't working with just any materials either. They were pioneering the use of calcium carbonate, silica, and other minerals that would become the standard building blocks for biological structures throughout the rest of Earth's history. Every seashell, every coral reef, every bone in your body uses construction techniques that were first developed by these pioneering organisms. The appearance of hard skeletons had another crucial consequence. It dramatically improved the fossil record. Soft-bodied organisms rarely fossilize well, which is why we know relatively little about the earliest multicellular life. But hard shells and skeletons preserve beautifully, giving us a much clearer picture of what happened next in the evolutionary story. And what happened next was nothing short of spectacular. The innovations that had been building up during the Ediacaran period suddenly exploded into the most dramatic diversification event in the history of animal life. Scientists call it the Cambrian explosion, and it represents perhaps the most important chapter in the story of complex life on Earth. Imagine walking along a beach in the early Cambrian period, about 540 million years ago. The first thing you'd notice is that this isn't like any modern beach you've ever seen. The landscape is completely barren, no plants, no insects, nothing green anywhere in sight. But wade into the shallow waters, and you'd find yourself in an alien wonderland unlike anything in today's oceans. Swimming through the water around you would be creatures that look like they were designed by a committee of science fiction writers having a particularly creative day. There's Opabinia, a bizarre predator with 5 mushroom-shaped eyes and a long proboscis ending in a grasping claw. Nearby swims Wiwaxia, covered in protective scales and spines like some kind of medieval armor. And lurking in the sediments is Hallucigenia, a creature so strange that scientists initially couldn't figure out which end was supposed to be the head. But the real star of this ancient menagerie was Anomalocaris, the apex predator of the Cambrian seas. This monster could grow over 6 feet long, making it by far the largest animal that had ever existed at that point in Earth's history. It propelled itself through the water with undulating fins along its sides, and captured prey with massive grasping appendages at the front of its head. The diversity of forms was absolutely mind-boggling. There were arthropods experimenting with every conceivable body plan, from the familiar-looking trilobites with their compound eyes and jointed legs, to bizarre forms like Morella, the so-called lace crab with its delicate swimming appendages and elegant head shield. Mollusks were getting in on the action too, developing the first sophisticated shells and experimenting with jet propulsion. Some early cephalopods could shoot backward through the water by forcibly expelling water from their body cavity, a technique still used by modern squid and octopuses. But perhaps the most significant group to emerge during this period were the earliest chordates, the group that would eventually give rise to all vertebrate animals, including us. These primitive chordates were small, worm-like creatures with a flexible rod running down their backs called a notochord. It doesn't sound like much, but that simple structure was the foundation for the most successful body plan in the history of complex life. The notochord provided structural support while remaining flexible, allowing for more sophisticated and coordinated movement than had ever been possible before. It was the prototype for the vertebral column that supports every fish, amphibian, reptile, bird, and mammal that has ever lived. These early chordates weren't much to look at. Pikaia, one of the first well-documented examples, was only about 2 inches long and looked more like a flattened worm than anything we'd recognize as related to modern vertebrates. But hidden in its simple anatomy were the beginnings of features that would eventually become the complex nervous systems, circulatory systems, and skeletal frameworks of higher animals. The speed at which all of this diversity appeared is one of the most remarkable aspects of the Cambrian explosion. We're talking about the evolution of complex eyes, sophisticated nervous systems, hard skeletons, and elaborate behavioral repertoires in just a few tens fast by evolutionary standards, especially for millions of years. That's incredibly innovations this fundamental. Part of the explanation lies in the concept of evolutionary arms races. Once predators appeared on the scene, there was intense selective pressure for better defenses. This drove the evolution of shells, spines, armor plating, and sophisticated escape behaviors. But better defenses meant that predators had to evolve better weapons and hunting strategies, which in turn drove further defensive innovations. This predator-prey arms race created a positive feedback loop that accelerated the pace of evolutionary innovation. Every new defensive strategy created opportunities for new types of predators. Every new hunting technique drove the evolution of new defensive countermeasures. The result was an explosion of biological creativity as organisms explored every possible solution to the fundamental problems of survival and reproduction. But there was another crucial factor driving this rapid diversification: the evolution of complex developmental programs. Building a sophisticated multicellular organism requires precise control over where different types of cells develop, when they differentiate into specialized tissues, and how they organize themselves into functional organ systems. The genetic toolkit for controlling these developmental processes was largely invented during the Cambrian period. Genes that regulate body segment formation, eye development, nervous system organization, and countless other crucial processes all trace their origins back to this remarkable period of evolutionary innovation. These developmental control genes, often called Hox genes, are so fundamental to animal biology that they've remained largely unchanged for over 500 million years. The same genetic switches that controlled body plan formation in Cambrian trilobites are still responsible for organizing the development of modern insects, fish, and mammals. It's a testament to just how successful these early genetic innovations were. Once evolution stumbled upon effective solutions for controlling complex development, those solutions became locked in as the foundation for all subsequent animal evolution. Every complex animal that has evolved since the Cambrian period has been built using variations on the basic developmental toolkit established during that ancient burst of creativity. The environmental conditions of the early Cambrian were perfect for this kind of explosive diversification. Oxygen levels were high enough to support active lifestyles and complex organ systems, but not so high as to create toxic conditions. The climate was warm and stable, with extensive shallow seas providing countless ecological niches for new types of organisms. Perhaps most importantly, the ecological landscape was still relatively empty. There were plenty of resources to go around, and countless unfilled niches waiting for organisms clever enough to exploit them. It was like having a vast continent with no inhabitants, perfect conditions for rapid colonization and diversification. The fossil sites where scientists study Cambrian life provide incredibly detailed snapshots of this ancient world. The Burgess Shale in British Columbia, the Chengjiang fauna in China, and similar deposits around the world preserve not just the hard shells and skeletons of ancient animals, but also their soft tissues, internal organs, and even the contents of their digestive systems. These exceptional preservation conditions have given scientists unprecedented insights into how early complex ecosystems functioned. We can see evidence of predation in the form of bite marks and defensive wounds. We can identify the gut contents of ancient animals, revealing who ate whom in these primordial food webs. We can even observe behavioral evidence, like the tracks and burrows left behind by animals going about their daily lives over 500 million years ago. One of the most remarkable discoveries from these fossil sites is just how modern many Cambrian ecosystems appear. Despite the alien appearance of individual organisms, the overall structure of these ancient communities is surprisingly familiar. There were primary producers at the base of the food web, herbivores that fed on them, small predators that hunted the herbivores, and large apex predators that dominated the entire system. The basic ecological roles that define modern marine ecosystems, filter feeders, deposit feeders, active predators, scavengers, were all established during the Cambrian period. The specific organisms filling those roles might have looked like creatures from another planet, but the fundamental structure of the ecosystem was remarkably similar to what we see in today's oceans. This ecological maturity is particularly striking when you consider how recently complex life had evolved. We're talking about ecosystems with sophisticated predator-prey relationships, complex food webs, and intricate behavioral interactions appearing just a few million years after the first multicellular organisms crawled out from beneath the melting ice of Snowball Earth. It suggests that once the basic toolkit for building complex organisms was established, the development of complex ecological relationships followed very quickly. The same evolutionary processes that drove the diversification of individual species also drove the organization of those species into structured communities with predictable patterns of interaction. The success of these early complex ecosystems set the stage for everything that followed in the history of life on Earth. The basic body plans established during the Cambrian period became the foundation for all subsequent animal evolution. The ecological roles pioneered by Cambrian organisms provided the template for every marine ecosystem that has existed since. But perhaps most importantly, the Cambrian explosion demonstrated that life, given the right conditions, is capable of incredible creativity and rapid innovation. The same forces that drove the explosive diversification of early animals, environmental opportunity, genetic flexibility, and ecological interaction continue to shape evolution today. Understanding this ancient burst of creativity provides crucial insights into how evolution works and how life responds to environmental change. It shows us that periods of environmental stress and opportunity can trigger rapid evolutionary innovation, leading to the emergence of entirely new types of organisms and ecosystems. It also highlights the interconnected nature of biological and environmental change. The same climate disaster that nearly wiped out all life on Earth ultimately provided the conditions necessary for the evolution of complex animals. The same oxygen that was produced as a byproduct of melting ice became the fuel that powered the first sophisticated nervous systems and muscle contractions. These connections remind us that evolution doesn't happen in isolation. It's shaped by complex interactions between organisms and their environment, by feedback loops between biological and physical processes, and by the accumulated innovations of countless previous generations. The legacy of the Cambrian explosion extends far beyond the specific organisms that lived during that remarkable period. The genetic, developmental, and ecological innovations that appeared during the early Cambrian continue to influence the evolution of life today. Every new species that evolves, every adaptation that develops, builds upon the foundational toolkit established over 500 million years ago in the aftermath of our planet's greatest climate disaster. As we face our own period of rapid environmental change, the story of Snowball Earth and its aftermath provides both perspective and hope. It reminds us that life is remarkably resilient and creative, capable of not just surviving catastrophic change, but using it as an opportunity for unprecedented innovation and diversification. The same planet that once lay frozen solid under miles of ice eventually gave rise to the incredible diversity of life we see today. The same evolutionary processes that transformed simple bacteria into complex animals continue to operate in the modern world, constantly generating new solutions to the challenges of survival and reproduction. In many ways, we are still living in the shadow of Snowball Earth. The oxygen we breathe, the complex bodies we inhabit, the intricate ecosystems that surround us, all trace their origins back to that ancient climate catastrophe and the remarkable evolutionary explosion that followed. We are, quite literally, children of the Ice Age that nearly ended life on Earth before it had barely begun. The transformation didn't stop with those first experimental animals. As millions of years passed, the descendants of Cambrian pioneers continued pushing the boundaries of what was possible with biological architecture. They were about to solve one of the most fundamental challenges facing any complex organism: how to grow large while still maintaining structural integrity. You see, there's a basic physics problem that every multicellular creature has to deal with. As you get bigger, your volume increases much faster than your surface area. This creates all sorts of issues with getting nutrients to your cells, removing waste products, and simply keeping your body from collapsing under its own weight. The earliest animals were small, partly because they hadn't yet figured out solutions to these scaling problems. But evolution, as we've seen, is remarkably creative when presented with challenges. The answer came in the form of internal skeletons, circulatory systems, and specialized organ networks that could efficiently distribute resources throughout increasingly large bodies. These weren't just minor improvements. They were revolutionary innovations that opened up entirely new possibilities for animal design. Take the development of true circulatory systems. Early animals relied on simple diffusion to move nutrients and oxygen around their bodies. That works fine if you're tiny, but it becomes hopelessly inefficient as you grow larger. The solution was to develop specialized pumping organs, hearts, that could actively circulate fluids throughout the body via networks of vessels. This might sound straightforward to us, but remember that these early animals were essentially inventing plumbing from scratch. They had to evolve specialized cells that could contract rhythmically, organize those cells into efficient pumping chambers, and develop branching networks of vessels to distribute the pumped fluid. All of this had to be coordinated by increasingly sophisticated nervous systems. The nervous system innovations of this period were equally remarkable. The simple nerve nets of early animals gradually evolved into centralized processing systems with specialized regions for different functions. Some areas became dedicated to processing sensory information, others to controlling movement, still others to coordinating basic life functions like breathing and circulation. These early brains weren't much to look at, just small clusters of nerve cells at the front end of primitive worms and arthropods. But they represented something entirely new in the history of life: centralized information processing. For the first time, an organism could integrate information from multiple sources, compare it to stored memories, and make complex decisions about how to respond. The implications were staggering. Animals with centralized nervous systems could learn from experience, modify their behavior based on changing conditions, and even engage in simple forms of planning and problem solving. They weren't just reacting to their environment anymore, they were actively interpreting it and making strategic decisions about how to navigate through it. This cognitive revolution had profound effects on ecosystem dynamics. Predators became more sophisticated hunters, capable of tracking prey over long distances and coordinating complex attack strategies. Prey animals developed equally sophisticated escape behaviors, learning to recognize danger signals and execute coordinated evasive maneuvers. The fossil record from this period shows clear evidence of this escalating arms race between predator and prey. Defensive structures became more elaborate and sophisticated. Some animals developed complex armor plating with overlapping segments that could flex without creating weak points. Others evolved chemical defense systems, producing toxins or noxious secretions to deter potential predators. Predators responded with their own innovations. Some developed more powerful jaws and sharper teeth. Others evolved specialized sensory systems that could detect hidden prey. A few pioneered entirely new hunting strategies, like cooperative pack behavior or sophisticated ambush techniques. But perhaps the most significant development during this period was the evolution of active swimming. Most early animals were either sessile, meaning they stayed in one place, or moved very slowly across the seafloor. Active swimming opened up the entire water column as a habitat and created new possibilities for both predation and escape. The first efficient swimmers were probably early cephalopods, relatives of modern squid and octopuses. They developed jet propulsion systems that allowed them to shoot through the water at remarkable speeds. Their combination of mobility, sophisticated nervous systems, and grasping appendages made them formidable predators in the ancient seas. Fish were still millions of years in the future, but these early active swimmers filled a similar ecological role. They were the ocean's first, high-speed pursuit predators, capable of chasing down prey across vast distances. This put enormous selective pressure on their potential victims to develop better escape strategies or more effective defenses. The result was another burst of evolutionary innovation as organisms explored every possible solution to the challenges of survival in an increasingly competitive world. Some animals developed better sensory systems to detect approaching predators. Others evolved more efficient swimming techniques or more effective camouflage patterns. A few took a completely different approach and began experimenting with life in new environments. The shallow coastal waters where most early animals lived were becoming crowded and competitive. There were opportunities for organisms brave enough to venture into deeper waters, onto land, or into other unexplored habitats. These pioneering species faced entirely new sets of challenges. Deeper waters were colder and darker, with different pressure conditions and food sources. Land was an alien environment with no water to provide buoyancy and completely different atmospheric conditions. But for organisms capable of adapting to these harsh new environments, there were also tremendous opportunities. The first ventures onto land were probably brief excursions by arthropods searching for food or escaping predators. These early terrestrial pioneers had to solve fundamental problems that had never been faced before. How do you support your body weight without water to provide buoyancy? How do you prevent your tissues from drying out in the alien atmosphere? How do you extract oxygen from air instead of water? The solutions to these problems would eventually lead to some of the most dramatic evolutionary innovations in Earth's history. Jointed legs for support, waterproof external skeletons to prevent desiccation, and specialized breathing systems for extracting oxygen from air. But these terrestrial adventures were still far in the future during the immediate aftermath of Snowball Earth. For sophisticated marine ecosystems were taking shape. The basic ecological now, the action remained focused in the oceans, where increasingly structure established during the Cambrian period was becoming more complex and more efficient. Food webs were developing multiple levels of predation, with smaller predators becoming prey for larger ones in intricate chains of consumption. Specialization was also increasing dramatically. Instead of generalist organisms that could eat whatever was available, evolution was producing specialists adapted for very specific ecological roles. Some became filter feeders, perfecting techniques for extracting tiny organisms from seawater. Others became deposit feeders, developing sophisticated digestive systems for processing organic matter from seafloor sediments. This increasing specialization had important consequences for ecosystem stability. Specialized organisms are often more efficient at what they do, but they're also more vulnerable to environmental changes that affect their particular niche. The trade-off between efficiency and flexibility would become a recurring theme throughout the subsequent history of life. Meanwhile, the physical environment was continuing to change in ways that would profoundly affect the trajectory of evolution. The extreme greenhouse conditions that had followed the melting of Snowball Earth were gradually moderating as atmospheric chemistry returned to more normal levels. Ocean temperatures were cooling from their post-thaw highs, and oxygen levels were stabilizing at concentrations that could support increasingly complex organisms. These environmental changes created new evolutionary pressures and opportunities. Organisms that had adapted to the extreme post-Snowball Earth conditions now had to readjust to more moderate climates. Some succeeded in making this transition and continued to diversify. Others couldn't adapt quickly enough and went extinct, leaving behind only fossil traces of their brief moment in evolutionary history. The constant interplay between environmental change and biological innovation was establishing patterns that would persist throughout the rest of Earth's history. Periods of environmental stability allowed for gradual evolutionary refinement and increasing specialization. Periods of rapid environmental change triggered bursts of innovation and diversification as organisms scrambled to adapt to new conditions. This dynamic relationship between life and environment was creating an increasingly complex and interconnected planetary system. Biological processes were beginning to influence atmospheric and oceanic chemistry on a global scale. The activities of countless organisms were altering the chemical composition of seawater, affecting the formation of sedimentary rocks, and even influencing climate patterns. These early examples of biological feedback on environmental conditions were laying the groundwork for the complex Earth system dynamics that characterize our planet today. Life wasn't just adapting to environmental conditions, it was actively participating in shaping those conditions through its collective metabolic activities. The oxygen that organisms were producing through photosynthesis was not only fueling the evolution of more complex life forms, it was also beginning to affect global climate patterns. Higher oxygen levels meant more efficient combustion of organic matter, which influenced carbon cycling and atmospheric chemistry in subtle but important ways. Similarly, the massive production of calcium carbonate shells and skeletons was beginning to affect ocean chemistry. Billions of tiny organisms were extracting dissolved minerals from seawater and incorporating them into their bodies. When these organisms died, Their shells accumulated on the seafloor, eventually forming vast limestone deposits that locked away enormous quantities of carbon. These biological influences on global geochemistry were still relatively minor compared to the massive volcanic and weathering processes that dominated Earth's chemical cycles. But they represented the beginning of biological control over planetary conditions, a trend that would accelerate dramatically as life became more diverse and abundant. The stage was being set for even more dramatic developments in the relationship between life and environment. Organisms were not only becoming more complex individually, they were also beginning to form more sophisticated ecological partnerships and communities. These biological communities would eventually become powerful enough to reshape entire landscapes and fundamentally alter the chemistry of Earth's atmosphere and oceans. But those developments were still millions of years in the future. For now, the descendants of Snowball Earth survivors were focused on the more immediate challenges of survival and reproduction in an increasingly competitive world. They were refining the basic body plans and ecological strategies that had emerged during the post-Thaw evolutionary explosion, gradually perfecting the biological innovations that would serve as the foundation for all subsequent animal evolution. The diversity and sophistication of these early animal communities was already remarkable by any standard. In just a few million years, life had gone from simple bacterial mats to complex ecosystems with multiple levels of predation, sophisticated behavioral interactions, and intricate food webs. The basic template for animal life had been established, and it was proving to be extraordinarily successful. Yet, this was still just the beginning of the story. The evolutionary innovations triggered by Snowball Earth were about to spread beyond the oceans and colonize every available habitat on the planet. The descendants of those first experimental animals would eventually take to the air, burrow deep into the earth, and even venture into the harsh realm of outer space. But perhaps more importantly, they would eventually give rise to organisms capable of consciousness, of wondering about their own origins, of piecing together the remarkable story of how a frozen planet became the vibrant, living world we inhabit today. The journey from bacterial survivor to self-aware being was still hundreds of millions of years away, but the essential foundations were being laid in the warm, oxygen-rich oceans of the post-Snowball Earth world. Every complex thought, every moment of consciousness, every scientific discovery that allows us to understand our own history can ultimately be traced back to those crucial innovations that emerged from our planet's greatest climate disaster. We are not just the descendants of Snowball Earth survivors, we are the living embodiment of evolution's most remarkable achievement, the transformation of simple organic matter into beings capable of comprehending the very universe that created us. The story continues to unfold around us every day, in every ecosystem, in every organism adapting to changing conditions, in every evolutionary innovation that pushes the boundaries of what's possible with biological matter. We are still riding the wave of creativity that began when our frozen planet finally thawed and life discovered the secret of building complex bodies from simple cells. In many ways, we are still early in the story. The universe is vast and old, and the possibilities for biological innovation seem limitless. The same evolutionary processes that transformed a Snowball Earth into a living world continue to operate today, constantly generating new forms of beauty, complexity, and wonder. The innovations didn't stop there. As these early animals spread throughout the oceans, they began encountering environments that demanded even more sophisticated solutions. Deep ocean basins with crushing pressure and eternal darkness. Shallow tropical lagoons with intense sunlight and fluctuating temperatures. Rocky intertidal zones where organisms had to survive both underwater and exposed to air. Each of these environments presented unique challenges that drove the evolution of increasingly specialized adaptations. Deep-sea creatures developed bioluminescent organs to create their own light in the perpetual darkness. Some evolved transparent bodies to become nearly invisible to predators. Others developed enormous mouths and expandable stomachs to take advantage of any food source they encountered in the nutrient-poor depths. Meanwhile, in the shallow tropical seas, a different kind of arms race was unfolding. Here, where sunlight penetrated to the seafloor and nutrients were abundant, competition for space became intense. Organisms began experimenting with colonial lifestyles, where multiple individuals would work together to build massive structures that could dominate entire sections of reef. These early colonial organisms were the ancestors of modern corals, but they were experimenting with architectural designs that have no modern equivalent. Some built towering spires that reached toward the surface like underwater skyscrapers. Others created sprawling platforms that covered vast areas of seafloor. A few developed branching, tree-like structures that maximized their surface area for capturing food and sunlight. The construction techniques these organisms developed were nothing short of revolutionary. They learned to extract calcium carbonate from seawater and deposit it in precisely controlled patterns to create structures of incredible complexity and beauty. Some incorporated organic fibers to increase tensile strength. Others developed techniques for creating curved surfaces and hollow chambers that maximize structural efficiency while minimizing material costs. But perhaps the most remarkable innovation was the development of symbiotic relationships between different species. Some colonial organisms began hosting photosynthetic bacteria within their tissues, essentially farming their own food supply. In return, they provided the bacteria with protection and access to sunlight. It was one of the first examples of true cooperation between different species, and it would become a dominant theme throughout the subsequent history of life. These symbiotic partnerships were incredibly successful. The combination of animal construction capabilities and bacterial photosynthesis created biological factories that could grow faster and larger than anything that had existed before. They began building reef systems that rivaled modern coral reefs in their complexity and diversity. The ecological impact of these early reefs was profound. They created three-dimensional habitat structures that provided shelter and feeding opportunities for countless other organisms. Small fish-like creatures darted between the reef branches, feeding on the abundant microscopic life. Primitive crustaceans scuttled through crevices in the reef structure, scavenging organic debris. Soft-bodied invertebrates attached themselves to reef surfaces, filtering nutrients from the water flowing past. These reef ecosystems became biodiversity hotspots, centers of evolutionary innovation where new species were constantly appearing. The complex three-dimensional structure of the reefs created countless microhabitats, each with its own unique set of environmental conditions. This habitat diversity drove the evolution of increasingly specialized organisms adapted to very specific niches within the reef community. Some creatures became specialists at living in the high-energy zones where waves crashed against the reef, developing powerful attachment mechanisms and streamlined body shapes. Others adapted to the quiet back reef areas where fine sediments accumulated, evolving sophisticated filtering systems and burrowing behaviors. Still others made their homes in the deep crevices within the reef structure, developing enhanced sensory systems for navigating in the perpetual twilight. The success of these early reef ecosystems had consequences that extended far beyond the reefs themselves. The massive construction projects undertaken by colonial organisms began to alter ocean chemistry on a regional scale. The extraction of calcium carbonate from seawater for shell and skeleton construction affected the chemical balance of entire ocean basins. This biological influence on ocean chemistry represented a new phase in the relationship between life and the physical environment. For the first time, living organisms were becoming powerful enough to alter the fundamental chemical properties of their habitat. It was an early example of what scientists now call ecosystem engineering, where organisms modify their environment in ways that affect the entire ecological community. The chemical changes caused by reef construction had cascading effects throughout marine ecosystems. Altered seawater chemistry affected the ability of other organisms to build their own shells and skeletons. Some species thrived in the new chemical environment, while others struggled to adapt. The result was another wave of evolutionary innovation as organisms developed new strategies for dealing with the changing conditions. Meanwhile, in the open ocean far from the reefs, a different kind of revolution was taking place. Free-swimming organisms were developing increasingly sophisticated navigation and hunting techniques. Some evolved complex sensory systems that could detect the minute electrical fields generated by other organisms. Others developed echolocation-like abilities that allowed them to navigate and hunt in murky water or complete darkness. The development of these advanced sensory capabilities had profound implications for predator-prey relationships. Prey animals could no longer rely on simply hiding or staying motionless to avoid detection. They had to develop active countermeasures, like the ability to jam or confuse predator sensory systems. Some evolved electrical organs that could generate powerful discharges to stun attackers. Others developed sophisticated camouflage systems that could change color and pattern in real time to match their surroundings. This sensory arms race drove the evolution of increasingly complex nervous systems. Simple clusters of nerve cells were no longer sufficient to process the flood of information coming from advanced sensory organs. Brains became larger and more sophisticated, with specialized regions dedicated to processing different types of sensory input. Some of these early brains began to show the first signs of what we might recognize as intelligence. They could learn from experience, form memories of past events, and use that information to predict future outcomes. A few species even showed evidence of problem-solving abilities, using tools or modifying their environment to achieve specific goals. The emergence of these cognitive abilities marked another crucial milestone in the history of life. For the first time, organisms were not just reacting to their environment, they were actively trying to understand it. They were developing internal models of how the world worked and using those models to guide their behavior in increasingly sophisticated ways. This cognitive revolution had far-reaching effects on ecosystem dynamics. Intelligent predators became far more effective hunters, capable of learning from their mistakes and developing new strategies for capturing elusive prey. But intelligent prey animals also became more effective at avoiding capture, learning to recognize danger signals and develop complex escape strategies. The result was an escalation in the sophistication of predator-prey interactions. Simple chase and escape scenarios gave way to complex behavioral games involving deception, misdirection, and strategic thinking. Some predators learned to work cooperatively, coordinating their attacks to overwhelm prey defenses. Prey animals responded by developing their own cooperative behaviors, forming groups that could provide early warning of approaching danger. These behavioral innovations were laying the groundwork for the complex social systems that would eventually characterize many animal species. The ability to communicate, coordinate activities, and share information became increasingly important for survival in competitive ecosystems. Organisms that could work together effectively had significant advantages over those that had to face the world alone. But social cooperation also created new evolutionary pressures. Living in groups meant competing for resources not just with other species, but with members of your own species. This drove the evolution of increasingly sophisticated mechanisms for resolving conflicts and allocating resources within groups. Some species developed complex dominance hierarchies that reduced the need for constant fighting over resources. Others evolved elaborate communication systems that allowed group members to coordinate their activities without direct physical interaction. A few pioneered division of labor systems where different individuals specialized in different tasks for the benefit of the entire group. These early experiments in social organization were remarkably successful. Social species often outcompeted their solitary relatives, taking over larger territories and exploiting resources more efficiently. The advantages of cooperation were so significant that social behavior evolved independently in many different lineages during this period. The success of social species had important implications for ecosystem structure. Large groups of cooperating organisms could modify their environment on a much larger scale than individual animals. They could build more extensive structures, exploit resources more thoroughly, and defend territory more effectively. Some social species began to have ecosystem-level effects, comparable to those of the colonial reef builders. Large herds of grazing animals could transform entire seafloor communities through their feeding activities. Swarms of filter-feeding organisms could strip plankton from vast volumes of water, affecting the entire marine food web. These biological modifications of the environment were becoming increasingly important drivers of evolutionary change. Organisms were no longer just adapting to physical environmental conditions, like temperature and chemistry. They were also adapting to biological environments created by the activities of other organisms. This led to increasingly complex ecological interactions and feedback loops. The success of one species could create opportunities for others, leading to cascading effects throughout the ecosystem. Alternatively, the decline of a key species could trigger ecosystem collapse, forcing rapid evolutionary adaptation or extinction for many other species. The fossil record from this period shows clear evidence of these complex ecological dynamics. There are examples of coordinated evolutionary changes across multiple species, suggesting that entire ecological communities were evolving together in response to changing conditions. There are also examples of sudden ecosystem collapses, followed by rapid evolutionary radiations as new species moved in to fill empty ecological niches. These patterns of ecosystem-level evolution were establishing precedents that would persist throughout the rest of Earth's history. The close coupling between biological and environmental change that had begun during the post-Snowball Earth recovery was becoming increasingly sophisticated and influential. Life was no longer just a passenger on planet Earth, responding passively to whatever environmental conditions happened to prevail. It was becoming an active participant in shaping planetary conditions, creating complex feedback loops between biological innovation and environmental change. The oxygen levels that had made complex life possible were themselves being influenced by the activities of the organisms that depended on them. The chemical composition of seawater was being altered by the massive production of biological minerals. Even climate patterns were beginning to be influenced by biological processes as organisms affected the cycling of carbon and other important atmospheric gases. These early examples of biological influence on planetary conditions were laying the foundation for what would eventually become a fully integrated Earth system, where biological, geological, and atmospheric processes are intimately interconnected. The planet was evolving into a complex, self-regulating system where life and environment continuously influence each other in sophisticated ways. But the most dramatic examples of this biological control over planetary conditions were still far in the future. For now, these early complex animals were focused on the more immediate challenges of survival and reproduction in rapidly changing marine ecosystems. The diversity of solutions they developed to these challenges was truly remarkable. Some lineages specialized in becoming bigger and more powerful, developing into the ocean's first giants. Others went in the opposite direction, becoming smaller and more efficient, filling ecological niches that larger animals couldn't access. A few lineages took the radical step of abandoning the ocean altogether, beginning the long evolutionary journey that would eventually lead to life on land. These pioneering terrestrial organisms faced challenges that were completely unprecedented in the history of life. They had to reinvent virtually every aspect of their biology to cope with the alien conditions they encountered outside the protective embrace of the sea. The first ventures onto land were probably brief and accidental. Perhaps some small arthropods got stranded in tidal pools and managed to survive long enough to scuttle back to the safety of deeper water. Or maybe some organisms followed food sources into the shallow margins of ancient coastlines and gradually adapted to spending more time out of water. Whatever the exact sequence of events, The colonization of land represented another quantum leap in the complexity and diversity of life on Earth. It opened up entirely new realms of possibility for evolutionary innovation and set the stage for some of the most dramatic chapters in the subsequent history of life. The challenges faced by these early terrestrial pioneers were formidable. Gravity, which was barely noticeable in the buoyant environment of water, suddenly became a major structural constraint. Organisms had to develop new types of skeletal systems and muscle arrangements to support their body weight against the constant downward pull. Water balance became another critical issue. In the ocean, organisms were surrounded by water and never had to worry about desiccation. On land, they were constantly losing moisture to the dry atmosphere and had to develop mechanisms for conserving water and preventing their tissues from drying out. Breathing presented yet another challenge. Extracting oxygen from water requires different anatomical structures than extracting oxygen from air. Early terrestrial organisms had to evolve entirely new respiratory systems, often while maintaining their ability to breathe underwater during their frequent returns to aquatic environments. Despite these enormous challenges, the potential rewards of terrestrial life were equally enormous. Land offered vast, unexploited territories with abundant resources and no competitors. The first organisms to successfully adapt to terrestrial conditions could essentially have entire continents to themselves. The evolutionary innovations required for terrestrial life would prove to be some of the most important in the history of complex organisms. Waterproof external coverings, efficient respiratory systems, robust skeletal structures, and sophisticated sensory systems adapted for air-based environments would all trace their origins to these early experiments in land colonization. But these terrestrial adventures were still in their very early stages during the immediate aftermath of Snowball Earth. The main action remained in the oceans, where the descendants of the first post-thaw organisms were continuing to diversify and experiment with new ways of life. The marine ecosystems of this period were becoming increasingly sophisticated and stable. The basic ecological roles and relationships that would characterize marine environments for the next 500 million years were becoming established. Food webs were developing multiple levels of complexity, with efficient energy transfer from primary producers through various levels of consumers. Nutrient cycling within these ecosystems was also becoming more efficient. Organisms were evolving specialized roles in breaking down organic matter and recycling nutrients back into forms that could be used by primary producers. These biogeochemical cycles were becoming increasingly important for maintaining ecosystem productivity and stability. The physical structures created by living organisms were also becoming more permanent and influential. Reef systems were growing larger and more complex, creating habitat diversity that supported ever greater numbers of species. Biological sediment production was accelerating as more and more organisms developed hard shells and skeletons. These different physical and chemical properties than purely geological types of seafloor environments with biological sediments were beginning to create new sediments. Organisms adapted to living quite different from those found in areas in these biologically modified environments were often dominated by inorganic sediments. The increasing environments was creating positive feedback loops that accelerated the biological modification of marine pace of evolutionary innovation. More complex environments provided more opportunities for specialization, which led to more species, which created even more complex environments. This positive feedback between biological diversity and environmental complexity was establishing patterns that would persist throughout the subsequent history of life. The most diverse ecosystems would consistently be those where organisms had the greatest impact on their physical environment, creating habitat complexity that could support large numbers of specialized species. But perhaps the most important legacy of this post-Snowball Earth evolutionary explosion was the establishment of the basic genetic and developmental toolkit that would be used to build all subsequent complex life. The fundamental mechanisms for controlling cell differentiation, tissue organization, and organ development were all invented during this crucial period. These developmental control systems were so successful that they've remained largely unchanged for over 500 million years. The same genetic switches that controlled the development of early Cambrian animals are still responsible for organizing the development of modern organisms, including humans. It's a testament to the extraordinary creativity and effectiveness of the evolutionary solutions that emerged from our planet's greatest climate disaster. In the space of just a few million years, life went from the simplest possible multicellular forms to organisms with sophisticated body plans, complex organ systems, and intricate ecological relationships. The speed and thoroughness of this transformation remains one of the most remarkable events in the history of life. It demonstrates the incredible potential for evolutionary innovation when the right conditions align: environmental opportunity, genetic flexibility, and ecological interaction. These same conditions continue to drive evolutionary innovation today, constantly generating new forms of biological complexity and diversity. We are still benefiting from the genetic and developmental innovations that first appeared in the warm, oxygen-rich oceans of the post-Snowball Earth world. Every breath we take uses respiratory systems descended from those first experiments in extracting oxygen from seawater. Every thought we think uses neural networks based on patterns first established in primitive Cambrian nervous systems. Every movement we make uses muscle and skeletal systems that trace their origins to the early evolution of active swimming and terrestrial locomotion. We are living proof of evolution's remarkable creativity and resilience. The same processes that transformed a frozen, lifeless planet into a thriving biological wonderland continue to operate around us every day, constantly pushing the boundaries of what's possible with organic matter. The story of Snowball Earth and its aftermath reminds us that even the most catastrophic events can sometimes lead to unprecedented opportunities for growth and innovation. Our planet's greatest climate disaster ultimately became the foundation for its greatest biological triumph, the evolution of complex life in all its magnificent diversity. As we face our own period of rapid environmental change, this ancient story provides both perspective and inspiration. It shows us that life is capable of remarkable resilience and creativity, that evolution can transform even the most challenging circumstances into opportunities for innovation and growth. The descendants of those first Snowball Earth survivors didn't just adapt to changing conditions. They thrived and diversified in ways that would have been impossible under the stable conditions that had prevailed for billions of years before the freeze. They used the crisis as a catalyst for revolutionary change, emerging stronger and more diverse than ever before. Perhaps most importantly, they established the foundation for everything that would follow. Every ecosystem, every species, every biological innovation that has appeared since then builds upon the genetic, developmental, and ecological toolkit that was first assembled in the aftermath of our planet's most severe climate disaster. We are all children of that ancient crisis, beneficiaries of evolution's remarkable ability to transform catastrophe into opportunity. The same creativity and resilience that carried life through Snowball Earth continues to flow through every living thing on our planet today, a testament to the extraordinary power of biological innovation when faced with seemingly impossible challenges. The journey from frozen wasteland to living world was long and difficult, but it produced something truly remarkable. A planet teeming with complex life in forms so diverse and beautiful that we're still discovering new species every day. It's a reminder that even in our darkest moments, evolution continues to work its patient magic, constantly creating new possibilities for growth, adaptation, and wonder. The ripple effects of this biological revolution were about to extend far beyond the oceans where it all began. As these early complex organisms continued to refine their body plans and ecological strategies, some began pushing into environments that had remained virtually untouched since the planet first formed. The margins between sea and land, those liminal spaces where waves crashed against ancient shorelines, were about to become the staging ground for one of evolution's most audacious experiments. Picture these primordial coastlines, nothing like the beaches we know today. No seaweed swaying in the shallows, no crabs scuttling across the sand, no birds wheeling overhead. Just bare rock and sediment, pounded endlessly by waves under an alien sky. The land beyond was equally barren, a vast expanse of stone and dust stretching to the horizon without a single trace of green. But hidden in the tidal pools and shallow lagoons of these desolate shores, something remarkable was stirring. Small arthropods, descendants of the marine pioneers we've been following, were beginning to venture beyond the safety of permanent water. At first, these excursions were brief and probably accidental. A receding tide might strand some creatures in shallow pools, forcing them to survive until the water returned. Most of these early terrestrial experiments ended in failure. The challenges of life outside water were simply overwhelming for organisms that had spent hundreds of millions of years perfecting aquatic lifestyles. But a few hardy individuals possessed just the right combination of traits to survive these temporary strandings. They had slightly more efficient ways of retaining moisture, marginally better structural support systems, or respiratory mechanisms that could extract a bit of oxygen from air as well as water. These survivors didn't immediately become land animals. Instead, they remained amphibious, splitting their time between aquatic and terrestrial environments. But each generation that managed to spend a little more time on land gained access to resources that their fully aquatic relatives couldn't reach. Organic debris washed up by storms, microscopic life forms that had colonized the margins of temporary pools, mineral deposits that could supplement their diet. The evolutionary pressure to exploit these terrestrial resources drove rapid innovation in body design. External skeletons became more robust to support body weight against gravity. Respiratory systems developed more efficient ways of extracting oxygen from air. Sensory organs adapted to detect airborne chemicals and vibrations transmitted through solid surfaces rather than water. One of the most crucial innovations was the development of waterproof external coatings. In water, organisms never had to worry about losing moisture to their environment. On land, desiccation was a constant threat that could kill within hours or even minutes. The first successful terrestrial organisms developed waxy secretions and specialized surface textures that dramatically reduced water loss through their external surfaces. These early waterproofing systems weren't perfect. The first land animals probably looked more like living raisins than the sleek creatures we might imagine. They were wrinkled and leathery, with every surface optimized for moisture retention rather than speed or agility. But they worked well enough to allow sustained activity in terrestrial environments. The sensory challenges of land life drove equally dramatic innovations. Water carries sound waves, chemical signals, and pressure changes very effectively. Air is a much less dense medium, requiring completely different strategies for detecting environmental information. The first land animals developed enhanced vibration detection systems that could sense approaching predators through ground tremors. They evolved more sensitive chemical receptors that could detect airborne odors and pheromones. Some of these early terrestrial pioneers began to show the first signs of what we might recognize as primitive hearing. They developed specialized structures that could detect pressure waves traveling through air, giving them awareness of events happening beyond their immediate vicinity. This was revolutionary technology that opened up entirely new possibilities for communication and environmental monitoring. But perhaps the most significant challenge facing these early land animals was nutrition. Marine ecosystems were rich with microscopic life that could be filtered from the water or scraped from surfaces. Terrestrial environments were essentially biological deserts, with very limited food sources available to the first colonists. The solution came from an unexpected source: decay. The constant washing of organic material from the sea onto ancient shorelines created accumulations of partially decomposed matter that could sustain specialized feeding strategies. Some early land animals became detritus feeders, developing digestive systems capable of extracting nutrients from decaying organic matter. Others took a more predatory approach, hunting the small marine creatures that got stranded in tidal pools or washed up on beaches. These early terrestrial predators were probably ambush hunters, hiding among rocks and debris to surprise their aquatic prey when they ventured too close to shore. The success of these pioneering terrestrial species created opportunities for secondary colonization. As populations of land animals grew, they became potential food sources for other organisms willing to make the transition from sea to land. This created the first simple terrestrial food webs, with predators, prey, and scavengers all adapting to life in the harsh conditions above the waterline. These early terrestrial ecosystems were incredibly fragile and limited in scope. They existed only in narrow bands along coastlines, dependent on the constant input of nutrients and organic matter from marine sources. But they represented something entirely new in the history of life: self-sustaining biological communities existing independently of aquatic environments. The environmental conditions on these ancient coastlines were extreme by modern standards. Without plant life to moderate temperature and humidity, the land surface experienced wild fluctuations between scorching heat during the day and near freezing cold at night. There was no soil in the modern sense, just broken rock and mineral sediments with very little organic content. UV radiation was another major hazard. Without the ozone layer that protects modern life, the sun's ultraviolet rays could cause severe damage to any organism exposed to direct sunlight for extended periods. Early land animals had to develop behavioral strategies for avoiding the most intense radiation, hiding under rocks or burrowing into sediments during the brightest parts of the day. Despite these harsh conditions, terrestrial life began to establish a foothold. Small arthropods developed increasingly sophisticated burrowing behaviors, creating underground refuges where they could escape both radiation and temperature extremes. Some began to show the first signs of social organization, with multiple individuals sharing burrow systems and coordinating their activities. The development of burrowing behavior had unexpected consequences for the terrestrial environment. As these early land animals excavated their underground shelters, they began to break up and mix the surface sediments in ways that had never happened before. This biological soil processing created new microenvironments that could support different types of organisms. Bacteria and other microorganisms began to colonize these biologically modified sediments, creating the first primitive soil communities. These microbial populations provided new food sources for the burrowing animals, establishing positive feedback loops that accelerated the development of terrestrial ecosystems. The chemical signatures left behind by these early soil-forming processes are still visible in the geological record today. Scientists can identify rock layers that were formed during this crucial period of early terrestrial colonization by their distinctive mineral compositions and organic residues. But while these pioneering terrestrial communities were establishing themselves along ancient coastlines, the main theatre of evolutionary innovation remained firmly in the oceans. The marine descendants of Snowball Earth survivors were continuing to diversify and experiment with increasingly sophisticated lifestyles. One of the most significant developments during this period was the evolution of active predation strategies that could cope with increasingly elusive prey. As potential victims developed better escape mechanisms and defensive strategies, predators had to become more intelligent and more coordinated in their hunting approaches. Some marine predators began to show evidence of pack hunting behaviors, working together to surround and overwhelm prey that could easily escape individual attackers. These coordinated hunting strategies required sophisticated communication systems and the ability to plan and execute complex behavioral sequences. The fossil record from this period shows clear evidence of these advanced predatory behaviors. There are examples of multiple predator fossils found together in association with the remains of large prey animals, suggesting coordinated group attacks. Some predator fossils show evidence of specialized hunting tools, like enlarged grasping appendages or reinforced jaw structures designed for dealing with heavily armored prey. The arms race between predators and prey was driving innovation on both sides of the equation. Prey animals were developing increasingly elaborate defense mechanisms, from sophisticated camouflage systems to chemical weapons that could disable or deter attackers. Some evolved rapid escape responses that could be triggered by the slightest hint of danger. Others took a completely different approach and developed defensive cooperation strategies. Schools of small animals could confuse predators with coordinated movement patterns, making it difficult for attackers to focus on individual targets. Some species developed alarm communication systems that could warn nearby individuals of approaching danger. These defensive innovations created new selective pressures for predators, driving the evolution of even more sophisticated hunting strategies. Some predators learned to exploit the communication systems of their prey, using false alarm signals to create panic and confusion. Others developed stealth technologies that could defeat even the most sensitive prey detection systems. The result was an escalating technological arms race that drove rapid innovation in neural complexity, sensory capabilities, and behavioral sophistication. Brains became larger and more specialized, with dedicated regions for processing different types of information and controlling complex behavioral sequences. Some of these advanced brains began to show the first signs of what we might recognize as genuine intelligence. They could solve novel problems, learn from experience, and even show evidence of planning and foresight. A few species developed primitive tool use behaviors, employing objects from their environment to achieve specific goals. The emergence of these cognitive abilities marked a crucial transition in the relationship between organisms and their environment. For the first time, animals were not just adapting to environmental conditions, they were actively trying to understand and manipulate those conditions to their own advantage. This cognitive revolution had profound implications for ecosystem dynamics. Intelligent animals could exploit resources more efficiently, avoid dangers more effectively, and coordinate their activities in ways that gave them significant advantages over less cognitively advanced competitors. But intelligence also created new types of ecological interactions. Intelligent predators and prey could engage in sophisticated behavioral games involving deception, misdirection, and strategic thinking. These psychological dimensions of predator-prey relationships added new layers of complexity to ecosystem dynamics. The development of advanced cognitive abilities also facilitated the evolution of more complex social systems. Intelligent animals could communicate more effectively, coordinate their activities more precisely, and develop more sophisticated mechanisms for resolving conflicts and allocating resources within groups. Some species began to show evidence of cultural transmission, where learned behaviors could be passed from one generation to the next through teaching and imitation rather than genetic inheritance. This cultural evolution allowed populations to adapt to changing conditions much more rapidly than would be possible through genetic evolution alone. The combination of genetic evolution and cultural transmission created powerful mechanisms for rapid adaptation and innovation. Populations could develop new behaviors and technologies within a single generation, then refine and improve those innovations through cultural learning processes. These early experiments in cultural evolution were laying the groundwork for some of the most remarkable developments in the subsequent history of life. The ability to accumulate and transmit knowledge across generations would eventually lead to technologies and capabilities that far exceeded what could be achieved through biological evolution alone. But these advanced cultural and technological developments were still far in the future. For now, these early intelligent marine animals were focused on the immediate challenges of survival and reproduction in increasingly competitive ecosystems. The success of intelligent species began to have ecosystem-wide effects as they outcompeted less cognitively advanced organisms for resources and habitat. This created new selective pressures that favored the evolution of intelligence in many different lineages, leading to what scientists call a cognitive arms race. As more and more species developed advanced cognitive abilities, the overall complexity of ecosystem interactions increased dramatically. Simple predator-prey relationships gave way to intricate networks of competition, cooperation, and coevolution that spanned multiple species and trophic levels. These complex ecological networks were remarkably stable despite their intricacy. The diversity of interactions and feedback loops made them resilient to disturbances and capable of maintaining their basic structure, even when individual species populations fluctuated significantly. The stability of these complex ecosystems created conditions that favored long-term evolutionary trends toward increasing specialization and efficiency. Species could invest in highly specialized adaptations, knowing that their ecological niches were likely to remain stable over extended periods. This specialization led to increasingly efficient resource utilization and more complete exploitation of available ecological opportunities. Ecosystems became more productive and more diverse as species developed increasingly refined ways of partitioning resources and reducing competitive overlap. The increasing productivity and diversity of marine ecosystems created surplus resources that could support the evolution of larger and more complex organisms. Some lineages began experimenting with gigantism, developing into the largest animals that had ever existed up to that point in Earth's history. These early giants faced unique physiological challenges related to maintaining structural integrity and efficient circulation in very large bodies. They had to develop innovative solutions for problems that smaller organisms never encountered, like how to pump blood through circulatory systems spanning many meters, or how to coordinate muscle contractions across enormous body masses. The solutions they developed were remarkably sophisticated, involving specialized pumping systems, redundant circulatory networks, and hierarchical nervous system organization that could control complex behaviors in very large bodies. Many of these innovations would later be adopted by terrestrial giants when vertebrates eventually colonized land environments. But size wasn't the only direction that evolution was exploring during this period. At the other extreme, some lineages were experimenting with miniaturization, developing into incredibly small organisms that could exploit microscopic habitats and resources. These tiny specialists developed their own suite of remarkable adaptations. They had to solve problems related to surface tension, viscous flow, and molecular diffusion that larger organisms never encountered. Their solutions often involved completely different approaches to locomotion, feeding, and reproduction than those used by larger relatives. The coexistence of giants and miniatures in the same ecosystems created opportunities for new types of ecological interactions. Some tiny organisms became specialized symbionts living on or inside larger hosts. Others became parasites that could exploit the resources of much larger organisms without being detected. These symbiotic and parasitic relationships added another layer of complexity to ecosystem dynamics. They created intimate connections between species that had very different lifestyles and ecological requirements, linking the fates of organisms that might otherwise have no direct interaction. The evolution of these complex multi-species associations was facilitated by the increasingly sophisticated immune systems that organisms were developing to deal with disease and parasitism. These immune systems had to be able to distinguish between beneficial symbionts and harmful parasites, leading to remarkable innovations in molecular recognition and cellular communication. Some of the molecular mechanisms developed for immune recognition were later co-opted for other functions, including cell-to-cell communication during development and neural signaling in advanced nervous systems. The evolution of immune systems thus contributed indirectly to many other important biological innovations. The increasing complexity of these post-Snowball Earth ecosystems was creating conditions that would support even more dramatic evolutionary innovations in the future. The genetic diversity, ecological opportunity, and selective pressure present in these ancient marine communities provided the raw materials and driving forces needed for the next major transitions in the history of life. But perhaps most importantly, these ecosystems were establishing the basic principles of ecological organization that would govern biological communities throughout the rest of Earth's history. The relationships between predators and prey, the dynamics of competition and cooperation, the mechanisms of resource allocation and energy flow, all of these fundamental ecological processes were being refined and perfected in the warm, oxygen-rich seas of the post-Snowball Earth world. The organisms living in these ancient oceans had no way of knowing that they were laying the foundation for everything that would follow. They were simply trying to survive and reproduce in their immediate environment, responding to the challenges and opportunities they encountered each day. But their collective efforts were creating something far greater than the sum of their individual parts. They were building the first truly complex ecosystems in Earth's history, biological communities of unprecedented diversity and sophistication that would serve as the template for all subsequent ecological development. These ancient marine ecosystems were proving that life, given the right conditions, could create systems of remarkable complexity and beauty. The same creative forces that had transformed simple bacterial survivors into complex multicellular organisms were now operating at the ecosystem level, generating intricate networks of interaction and interdependence that spanned entire ocean basins. The legacy of this ecosystem-level innovation would prove to be just as important as the biological innovations happening at the level of individual organisms. The ecological principles and relationships established during this crucial period would continue to shape the evolution of life for hundreds of millions of years to come. We can still see echoes of these ancient ecological innovations in modern ecosystems. The basic structure of marine food webs, the relationships between different trophic levels, the mechanisms of nutrient cycling and energy flow, all trace their origins back to this remarkable period of ecological experimentation following Snowball Earth. In many ways, we are still living in ecosystems that operate according to principles first established over 500 million years ago. The creative explosion that followed our planet's greatest climate disaster didn't just give rise to complex organisms, it gave rise to complex ecological relationships that continue to govern the natural world today. As we continue to explore and understand these ancient ecosystems, we gain deeper insights into how life responds to environmental challenges and opportunities. The story of post-Snowball Earth evolution shows us that even the most severe environmental catastrophes can become catalysts for unprecedented biological and ecological innovation. It reminds us that life is not just remarkably resilient, but remarkably creative, constantly finding new ways to exploit available resources and adapt to changing conditions. The same processes that transformed a frozen planet into a thriving biological wonderland continue to operate today, constantly generating new forms of complexity and diversity. The innovations that emerged from Snowball Earth continue to influence the evolution of life in countless ways. Every complex ecosystem, every sophisticated organism, every remarkable adaptation we see in the modern world builds upon the foundation established during that crucial period of recovery and innovation. We are all beneficiaries of that ancient creative explosion, living proof of evolution's extraordinary ability to transform catastrophe into opportunity. The story of Snowball Earth and its aftermath reminds us that even in the face of seemingly impossible challenges, life finds a way not just to survive, but to thrive and diversify in ways that exceed our wildest imagination. The descendants of those ancient ecosystem architects were about to face their next great test. As millions of years rolled by, the stable conditions that had allowed such remarkable diversification began to shift once again. Climate patterns were changing, ocean chemistry was evolving, and new environmental pressures were building that would challenge even the most sophisticated biological communities. But this time, life was better prepared. The genetic toolkit developed during the post-Snowball Earth recovery had been refined and expanded through countless generations of innovation. The ecological relationships that governed marine communities had been tested and strengthened through millions of years of coevolution. The cognitive abilities that allowed organisms to understand and manipulate their environment had reached new levels of sophistication. When the next wave of environmental challenges arrived, life didn't just survive. It used those challenges as stepping stones to even greater complexity. The same pattern that had emerged from the original Snowball Earth disaster was about to repeat itself on an even grander scale. This time, however, the innovations wouldn't be limited to marine environments. The tentative experiments in terrestrial life that had begun along ancient coastlines were about to explode into a full-scale colonization of the land. The empty continents that had remained barren for billions of years were finally ready to support complex biological communities. The transition began with the most unlikely pioneers. Microscopic organisms that had been quietly experimenting with life in temporary pools and moist soil began to develop more permanent terrestrial lifestyles. These tiny trailblazers faced challenges that their marine ancestors could never have imagined. Temperature regulation became a constant struggle. Without the buffering effect of large bodies of water, terrestrial environments experienced extreme daily and seasonal temperature swings. Early land organisms had to develop internal mechanisms for maintaining stable body temperatures despite these wild fluctuations. Some evolved behavioral strategies, becoming active only during the cooler parts of the day and seeking shelter during temperature extremes. Others developed physiological adaptations, like specialized proteins that could function across wider temperature ranges, or cellular mechanisms that could repair damage caused by thermal stress. The problem of water scarcity was even more challenging. Marine organisms were surrounded by water and never had to worry about finding enough moisture to survive. Terrestrial organisms had to actively seek out water sources and develop sophisticated mechanisms for conserving every precious drop. Early solutions were crude but effective. Some organisms developed the ability to absorb moisture directly from humid air through specialized surface structures. Others learned to extract water from their food more efficiently, recycling and reusing every available molecule. As these pioneering terrestrial communities became more established, they began to modify their environment in ways that made it more hospitable for other organisms. Their decomposing bodies added organic matter to mineral sediments, creating the first primitive soils. Their metabolic activities began to alter local atmospheric conditions, creating microenvironments with higher humidity and more stable temperatures. These biological modifications of terrestrial environments created positive feedback loops that accelerated the pace of land colonization. As conditions became more favorable, larger and more complex organisms could make the transition from sea to land. Each successful colonist made the environment a little more hospitable for the next wave of immigrants. The early terrestrial food webs that developed were remarkably simple compared to their marine counterparts. There were few species and even fewer trophic levels. Most organisms were either decomposers feeding on organic debris or small predators hunting the decomposers. But even these simple terrestrial communities began to show signs of the complex ecological relationships that would eventually characterize land ecosystems. Competition for limited resources drove the evolution of specialized feeding strategies. Predation pressure selected for better defensive mechanisms and escape behaviors. Some of the most successful early terrestrial organisms were those that maintained connections to aquatic environments. They could exploit terrestrial resources during favorable conditions while retreating to the safety of water when environmental stresses became too severe. These amphibious lifestyles required remarkable physiological flexibility. Organisms had to be able to function effectively in both aquatic and terrestrial environments, switching between different respiratory systems, locomotion strategies, and sensory modalities as conditions demanded. The anatomical innovations required for successful amphibious life were extraordinary. Respiratory systems had to be able to extract oxygen efficiently from both water and air. Circulatory systems had to function effectively despite the very different pressure and buoyancy conditions in aquatic versus terrestrial environments. Skeletal and muscular systems face perhaps the greatest challenges. The structural support requirements for terrestrial locomotion were completely different from those needed for swimming. Early amphibious organisms had to develop musculoskeletal systems that could handle both types of movement effectively. Some of these early amphibians began to show the first signs of what would eventually become one of the most important innovations in vertebrate evolution: the development of limbs specialized for terrestrial locomotion. These weren't yet the sophisticated legs of modern land vertebrates, but they represented crucial first steps in that direction. The sensory challenges of amphibious life drove equally remarkable innovations. Vision systems had to work effectively in both the high-density medium of water and the low-density medium of air. Chemical detection systems had to be sensitive to both waterborne and airborne molecules. Some amphibious organisms developed dual sensory systems, with specialized organs for aquatic sensing and separate organs for terrestrial sensing. Others evolved more generalized sensory systems that could function adequately in both environments, though perhaps not as efficiently as specialized systems. The most successful amphibious species were those that could coordinate their terrestrial and aquatic activities to maximize the advantages of both environments. They used terrestrial environments for activities like feeding and territory defense, while returning to water for reproduction and refuge during environmental extremes. These behavioral strategies required sophisticated internal timing mechanisms that could coordinate activities with environmental cycles. Some organisms developed biological clocks that could track daily temperature and humidity patterns, allowing them to optimize their activity schedules for maximum efficiency and safety. Others evolved more complex behavioral repertoires that could respond flexibly to changing environmental conditions. They could assess current conditions and make strategic decisions about whether to remain terrestrial or return to aquatic environments based on factors like food availability, predation risk, and weather patterns. The success of these early amphibious communities began to have significant effects on both terrestrial and aquatic ecosystems. Their activities created new connections between land and water environments, facilitating the transfer of nutrients and energy between previously isolated habitats. Organic matter produced in terrestrial environments began to wash into aquatic systems during storms and floods, providing new food sources for marine and freshwater communities. Conversely, nutrients from aquatic systems were being transported onto land by the activities of amphibious organisms. These ecosystem-level connections were creating more complex and more productive biological communities. The increased connectivity allowed for more efficient resource utilization and created new opportunities for specialization and ecological innovation. Some organisms began to specialize in exploiting the interface zones between terrestrial and aquatic environments. They developed unique adaptations for living in tidal zones, floodplains, and other transitional habitats that experience regular alternation between aquatic and terrestrial conditions. These interface specialists often developed remarkable tolerance for environmental variability. They could survive conditions that would kill organisms adapted exclusively to either terrestrial or aquatic environments. Their success demonstrated the advantages of evolutionary flexibility in the face of environmental uncertainty. The innovations developed by interface specialists began to influence the evolution of organisms in both terrestrial and aquatic environments. Genes and developmental pathways that provided tolerance for environmental variation spread through populations, increasing the overall resilience of biological communities. Meanwhile, back in the fully marine environments, where complex life had first evolved, new innovations were continuing to emerge. The success of terrestrial colonization had created new selective pressures in marine ecosystems. As resources and habitat space became more limited, competition in marine environments intensified, driving the evolution of more efficient feeding strategies, more sophisticated predator avoidance mechanisms, and more effective reproductive strategies. Some marine organisms responded by becoming more specialized, focusing their efforts on exploiting very specific ecological niches. Others took the opposite approach and became more generalized, developing the ability to exploit a wider range of resources and habitats. This generalist strategy provided insurance against environmental variability, but often at the cost of reduced efficiency in any particular ecological role. The tension between specialization and generalization became a recurring theme in the evolution of complex ecosystems. Different environmental conditions favored different strategies, leading to complex patterns of evolutionary change that varied across space and time. Some of the most successful organisms were those that could switch between specialist and generalist strategies, depending on environmental conditions. They could focus their efforts on preferred resources when those resources were abundant, but could also exploit alternative resources when their preferred options became scarce. This strategic flexibility required sophisticated behavioral and physiological control systems. Organisms had to be able to assess resource availability, evaluate alternative options, and coordinate their activities accordingly. These capabilities represented significant advances in cognitive and behavioral complexity. The evolution of flexible strategies also required more sophisticated developmental systems. Organisms had to be able to modify their anatomy and physiology in response to environmental cues, developing the characteristics best suited to current conditions. Some species evolved remarkable developmental plasticity, with individuals able to develop completely different body forms depending on the environmental conditions they experienced during critical developmental periods. This phenotypic plasticity allowed single genotypes to produce multiple phenotypes, each adapted to different environmental conditions. The success of developmentally plastic organisms had important implications for evolution and ecology. It allowed populations to adapt rapidly to changing conditions without waiting for genetic evolution to produce new adaptations. It also increased the range of environments that could be successfully colonized by single species. But developmental plasticity also created new evolutionary challenges. Organisms had to maintain the genetic and developmental machinery necessary for producing multiple phenotypes, even when only one phenotype was currently advantageous. This maintenance cost could reduce efficiency and competitiveness in stable environments. The balance between the costs and benefits of developmental plasticity became another important factor, shaping evolutionary trajectories. In highly variable environments, the benefits usually outweighed the costs. In stable environments, more specialized strategies often prove superior. These evolutionary dynamics were creating increasingly complex and sophisticated biological communities. The interplay between specialization and generalization, between genetic adaptation and developmental plasticity, between terrestrial and aquatic lifestyles, was generating unprecedented levels of biological diversity and ecological complexity. The fossil record from this period shows clear evidence of accelerating evolutionary innovation. New body plans were appearing at an increasing rate, and existing body plans were being modified and refined in increasingly sophisticated ways. The pace of morphological evolution was reaching levels that would not be seen again for hundreds of millions of years. But perhaps even more remarkable than the morphological innovations were the behavioral and ecological innovations that were emerging. Organisms were developing increasingly complex social systems, more sophisticated communication mechanisms, and more elaborate cooperative behaviors. Some species began to show evidence of primitive culture, with learned behaviors being transmitted from one generation to the next through teaching and imitation. These cultural innovations could spread through populations much more rapidly than genetic changes, allowing for rapid adaptation to new challenges and opportunities. The emergence of cultural transmission created new evolutionary dynamics that operated on much faster timescales than genetic evolution. Populations could develop new technologies and strategies within a few generations, then continue to refine and improve those innovations through cultural learning processes. These cultural evolutionary processes were beginning to have significant effects on biological evolution itself. Culturally transmitted behaviors could create new selective pressures that influenced genetic evolution, leading to feedback loops between cultural and biological evolution. Some of the most successful species were those that developed strong cultural learning abilities. They could rapidly acquire and refine beneficial behaviors, giving them significant advantages in competitive interactions with less culturally sophisticated species. The success of cultural learning also created new types of ecological interactions. Species with advanced cultural abilities could engage in more sophisticated forms of cooperation and competition, leading to more complex and dynamic ecosystem relationships. These cultural innovations were laying the groundwork for some of the most remarkable developments in the subsequent history of life. The ability to accumulate knowledge and technology across generations would eventually lead to capabilities that far exceeded what could be achieved through biological evolution alone. But those advanced developments were still far in the future. For now, these early experiments in cultural evolution were focused on solving immediate practical problems like finding food, avoiding predators, and successfully reproducing in increasingly competitive environments. The solutions they developed were often remarkably clever and sophisticated. Some species learned to use tools to access food sources that were otherwise unavailable. Others developed complex communication systems that allowed coordinated group activities like cooperative hunting or collective defense. A few species began to show evidence of abstract thinking abilities, like the capacity to plan future activities or to understand causal relationships between events. These cognitive capabilities opened up entirely new possibilities for environmental manipulation and social organization. The organisms that developed these advanced cognitive abilities often became keystone species in their ecosystems, with their activities having disproportionate effects on community structure and ecosystem function. Their innovations in tool use, communication, and social organization influenced the evolution of many other species in their communities. The cascading effects of these cognitive innovations were creating positive feedback loops that accelerated the pace of evolutionary change throughout entire ecosystems. As some species became more intelligent and more capable, they created new challenges and opportunities for other species, driving further innovation and complexity. These dynamics were establishing patterns that would persist throughout the subsequent history of life on Earth. The most successful ecosystems would consistently be those where cognitive innovation and cultural evolution were most active, creating environments that favored continued learning and adaptation. The legacy of these early experiments in intelligence and culture would prove to be one of the most important outcomes of the post-Snowball Earth evolutionary explosion. The cognitive foundations established during this crucial period would eventually give rise to the most remarkable phenomenon in the history of our planet: the emergence of consciousness and self-awareness. But even without knowing where these innovations would ultimately lead, it was clear that something extraordinary was happening in the warm, oxygen-rich world that had emerged from the ice. Life was not just recovering from its greatest catastrophe, it was transforming that catastrophe into the foundation for unprecedented creativity and complexity. The story was far from over. Far from the innovations that had emerged from Snowball Earth were about to spread throughout the planet, colonizing every available habitat and pushing the boundaries of what was possible with biological matter. The next chapters would see even more dramatic developments as life continued its relentless exploration of evolutionary possibility space. From the deepest ocean trenches to the highest mountain peaks, from scorching deserts to frozen tundra, the descendants of Snowball Earth survivors would eventually colonize every corner of our planet, and in doing so, they would create the magnificent tapestry of life that surrounds us today. a living testament to evolution's extraordinary creativity and resilience. The journey from frozen wasteland to vibrant biosphere was nearly complete, but the most remarkable chapters were yet to be written. The same evolutionary processes that had carried life through its darkest hour were about to produce innovations that would reshape the very concept of what it means to be alive on planet Earth. The innovations radiating outward from those first terrestrial experiments were about to encounter something that would change the trajectory of life forever. As these early land colonists spread across ancient coastlines, they began interacting with forces that had been quietly building beneath the surface of their world. The same geological processes that had rescued Earth from its frozen prison were still active, still reshaping the planet in ways that would create entirely new opportunities for biological innovation. Volcanic activity was increasing across multiple continents. Not the catastrophic planet-saving eruptions that had ended Snowball Earth, but something more subtle and ultimately more transformative. These new volcanic systems were releasing different combinations of gases and minerals into the atmosphere, creating chemical conditions that had never existed before in Earth's history. The most significant change was in atmospheric composition. Oxygen levels, which had already risen dramatically during the post-thaw period, were continuing to climb. But now, they were being joined by other gases that would prove equally important for the future of complex life. Nitrogen compounds, sulfur compounds, and trace gases that would eventually become essential components of biological chemistry were accumulating in concentrations that opened up new metabolic possibilities. These atmospheric changes weren't happening in isolation. They were interacting with the biological modifications that early terrestrial organisms were making to their environment. The primitive soils being created by decomposing organic matter were becoming chemically active, hosting reactions between atmospheric gases and biological waste products that produced entirely new compounds. Some of these new compounds turned out to be remarkably useful for living organisms. They could serve as more efficient energy sources, more effective building materials for biological structures, or more sophisticated signaling molecules for communication between cells. The organisms that learned to exploit these new chemical resources gained significant advantages over their competitors. But accessing these new resources required evolutionary innovations that pushed the boundaries of biological chemistry. Organisms had to develop new metabolic pathways, new enzymatic systems, and new cellular structures capable of handling chemical processes that no living thing had ever attempted before. The solutions they developed were often breathtakingly elegant. Some organisms evolved modular enzymatic systems that could be recombined in different ways to handle different chemical substrates. Others developed sophisticated chemical sensing systems that could detect and track the availability of new resources across complex environmental gradients. A few pioneering species took the radical step of forming cooperative partnerships with other organisms that had complementary chemical capabilities. These early symbiotic relationships allowed partners to accomplish together what neither could achieve alone, exploiting chemical resources that were inaccessible to any single species. The success of these chemical innovators had cascading effects throughout early terrestrial ecosystems. As new metabolic pathways became available, entirely new ecological roles became possible. Organisms could specialize in processing specific chemical compounds, creating new links in food webs and new opportunities for energy flow through ecosystems. The increasing chemical sophistication of terrestrial life began to influence atmospheric chemistry on a global scale. The metabolic activities of countless organisms were collectively altering the composition of Earth's atmosphere in subtle but important ways. These biological influences on atmospheric chemistry would eventually become one of the most important drivers of planetary environmental change. Meanwhile, the physical structure of terrestrial environments was becoming increasingly complex. The first organisms to successfully colonize land had been small and relatively simple, capable of surviving in harsh conditions, but unable to significantly modify their environment. Their descendants were beginning to change that equation. Larger, more robust organisms were appearing that could actively reshape terrestrial landscapes. Some developed powerful digging capabilities that allowed them to excavate extensive burrow systems. Others evolved the ability to build surface structures that could alter local environmental conditions. These ecosystem engineers were creating three-dimensional habitat complexity that had never existed before in terrestrial environments. Their excavations and constructions created microenvironments with different temperature, humidity, and chemical conditions than the surrounding landscape. The habitat diversity created by these ecosystem engineers supported the evolution of increasingly specialized organisms, adapted to very specific environmental conditions. Some species became specialists in living in the deep, stable conditions of elaborate burrow systems. Others adapted to the exposed, variable conditions of surface constructions. This habitat diversification drove another burst of evolutionary innovation as organisms explored new ecological niches that had been created by the engineering activities of their predecessors. The feedback loop between ecosystem engineering and evolutionary diversification was accelerating the pace of change in terrestrial environments. But perhaps the most significant development during this period was the emergence of organisms capable of fundamentally altering the energy flow through terrestrial ecosystems. Up to this point, terrestrial food webs had been entirely dependent on organic matter imported from marine environments or produced by decomposition processes. Now, for the first time, organisms were appearing that could capture energy directly from sunlight and use it to produce organic compounds in terrestrial environments. These early photosynthetic terrestrial organisms weren't plants in the modern sense, but they represented the first step toward energy independence for land-based ecosystems. The initial experiments in terrestrial photosynthesis were crude and inefficient. Early photosynthetic organisms could only survive in very specific environmental conditions where moisture, light, and nutrients were all available in precisely the right combinations. But even these primitive systems represented a revolutionary breakthrough. For the first time in Earth's history, terrestrial environments could support primary production independent of marine inputs. This energy independence allowed for the development of more complex terrestrial food webs with multiple trophic levels and more sophisticated ecological relationships. The success of early terrestrial photosynthesis drove rapid innovation in light-capturing technologies. Different organisms experimented with different approaches to maximizing their exposure to sunlight, while minimizing water loss and other environmental stresses. And so, we come to the end of this remarkable journey from a planet locked in ice for 25 million years to the vibrant, complex world that would eventually give rise to us. The story of Snowball Earth isn't just about survival against impossible odds. It's about transformation, about how catastrophe became the catalyst for life's greatest creative explosion. Every breath you take, every thought you think, every heartbeat that sustains you can be traced back to those crucial innovations that emerged from our planet's darkest hour. We are all children of that ancient freeze, living proof that even the most devastating disasters can become the foundation for something extraordinary and beautiful.